Welcome to the next part of our video series, Starting Points. And in this one, we're going to look at what I've called a couple of times in the earlier videos, the second circle, how we behave. And as I mentioned earlier on, this is where we're going to look at Jesus' teachings for his people, for the people of God, that we find in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And this is the most comprehensive collection of Jesus' teachings on how we should behave. So there's roughly 10 or 11 or 12 directives in the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm going to just walk through them. When you read the originals, you'll find them accompanied by illustrations, and I'm not going to go into illustrations. I'm just going to keep it fairly simple for now. But Jesus notices, first of all, he says, he has this way of saying, he says, "You've heard that it was said, but I'm telling you." So in other words, he's got something more to say, or maybe something a bit deeper to say, or maybe something, or maybe a way of looking at the commands from God in a way that's somewhat different from what the religious teachers of his day were teaching. Anyway, he says, "You've heard that it was said, you must not murder." So Jesus says, well, that's good, but also consider the roots of murder: anger, hatred, jealousy. All these things are cut from the same cloth. And then Jesus has a nice illustration in which he teaches that the way to fulfill the law not to murder is to live at peace with all your neighbors. The next thing he comments about is about adultery. He says, "You've heard that it was said," and so adultery is forbidden, and so Jesus has a number of pointed illustrations because he notices some of the behaviors of some of the people around him. I think especially of the younger guys, and he ends up saying, no to adultery and casual divorce. Instead, learn how to respect the commitments of women and men, your commitments, and the commitments that other people make to each other. Don't mess with them. Thirdly, Jesus has a few things to say about swearing and making impressive sounding oaths, and using God's name to make those oaths sound very impressive. And Jesus says, no, that's not the way. And he ends up teaching really no flashy promises, but just be a trustworthy person. The way he puts it is, let your yes be yes and let your no be no. In other words, just be trustworthy all the time, and don't worry about swearing and making all kinds of oaths, but be a trusted, a truthful person. Fourth, he talks about revenge, and again, he has a few stories which are kind of pointed, but the main message there is, don't take revenge on people when they take from you something that is not theirs to take, but instead try to find a way to disarm their ill behavior. Maybe give them a little bit more than they were looking for. Try to find some ways to get behind their approach. Don't follow their path. They may like to up the ante, get involved in a cycle of revenge, but Jesus says, no. If you're gonna walk with me, you're not going to be. You must not take revenge on other people. And by the way, the teaching not to take revenge, well, that's a powerful teaching, and it is widely ignored. And I think it's ignored to our peril many times on the international scene. One country offends another, we're going to up the ante. The next country is going to do something tougher. Before you know it, harsh, strong words become harder and stronger, and then the words lead into actions, and the actions become stronger, and we have a lot of disaster and war on account of that kind of dynamic. So Jesus says, no, that is not the way. Instead, learn how to disarm people who want to get involved in a cycle of revenge. Related to that, don't just love your friends. There's no great virtue in that. Jesus says everybody does that. That's easy. But if you're gonna follow me, if you're gonna be a person of God, do the really hard thing. Learn how to love your enemies. I don't like that command because I've often found people that I don't find particularly likable, and sometimes they've, from my perspective, have really tried to do a number on me. I don't feel very well disposed toward them, but Jesus commands me to love my enemies, pray for them, and if there's something I can do for them, I must not withhold that, but love your enemies too. And think again, just as with the previous command about not taking revenge, how that would change things if it were more deeply and widely followed all over the planet. Sixth, Jesus says, be generous, but not for the publicity. So if you read the Sermon on the Mount, you'll see where he illustrates that, because he notices that some of the religious leaders like to be generous, but like everybody to know about it. Jesus says, no, that's not the way if you're going to follow God truly. You're going to be generous because that's what God wants, period. That's why. 7, Jesus says, pray with simplicity and for what's really important. He noticed that especially some of the more respected religious leaders of his time used to like making public prayers and receive all kinds of compliments for their wonderful, wonderful prayers. And Jesus says, no, that is not what prayer is about. Prayer is about speaking simply from the heart. That's just fine. You don't need to load your prayers up with all kinds of elaborate words. Sometimes people ask me, Pastor Mike or Chaplain Mike, how should I pray? And I usually say, well, prayer is really a very simple definition. Is it's talking with God. That's really it. It's talking with God. So tell him what's on your heart. Tell him what's on your mind. They might be things that you think God doesn't want to hear. Don't worry about it. Be respectful, but tell him what's really on your heart and mind. They may be very painful things. In some of the prayers of the Bible, you do find people speaking sometimes disappointed with God, sometimes even angry, saying, where are you, God, when I really need you? So don't hesitate to speak truly from the heart and ask for what's important, and that is the kingdom of God, or maybe we should say the influence of God in your own life and in the life of your church community and in the world around us. 8th, don't focus too much on food, money, clothing, and so on. You're going to need some of that stuff. Jesus, of course, ate. He used money. He wore clothes. He's not opposed to these things, but don't focus on them as so many people in our world like to do. They're all about the bling, about having the cool gadgets, the beautiful cars, the beautiful homes, the clothing. Maybe some of them pursuing celebrity status. Jesus says, no, that's not what your life is meant to be about. Your life is meant to be about seeking God's influence in your life and in the life around you. Now, the 9th thing that I've got is where Jesus says, don't judge other people for their quote-unquote failures. There's a lot of that going on. I notice especially online, people trying to cancel each other out or throwing insults around. This is not the way if you're going to be a follower of Jesus. We're not going to throw insults around. We're not going to try to cancel other people. We're not going to try to judge other people for their failures. There is one person about who you and I may be a little bit judgmental. Maybe you can guess who it is. It's our own self. Jesus has an illustration, and in it, it's very clear what he means to teach is, don't bother looking for somebody else's faults, but look at your own life. You and I will find lots to improve on if we just look in the mirror. In the meantime, look at other people graciously. Look at other people graciously, because that's how you want other people to look upon you, and it's also how you want God to look at you. You don't want him being judgy toward you. You want him to be gracious toward you. So we need to be on the same page with God. And 10th, Jesus says, count on God to help you. Jesus says, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find, knock, or the way I like to put it, bang on God's door if you need it, if you need to, ask, seek, knock, and the door will be opened. So in other words, Jesus is encouraging us to ask God for our needs, however great or small they may be. And lastly, Jesus says, all of these commands about how to behave, they can all boil down to one thing, and that is to treat others as you yourself want to be treated. Jesus is once asked, what's the greatest commandment? And he said the greatest one is to love God, and the second one that's right up there on the same level is love your neighbor as yourself. Love God and love your neighbor. And by the way, the two are closely related. If we love God, we will do what he calls us to do, and that is to love our neighbor. We don't love our neighbor because other people tell us to. Many people rely on that as their basis for loving the neighbor. We are called to love the neighbor because God requires it of us. And then Jesus has this very cute, not cute, but a very, I think, catchy illustration. I mean, all these three chapters, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, are loaded with catchy illustrations. Sometimes very, very dramatic or intense ones which are even kind of disturbing. But you're not going to forget the teaching that illustration is meant to convey. Well, Jesus says, don't be like I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but don't be like a careless house builder. Looking for shortcuts, especially the shortcut of not building on a good foundation. Because, as you might know, if you're building a house or any kind of a structure, you need a good foundation. Otherwise, don't bother building because it'll fall apart. Jesus says, build your life on my teachings. That's the foundation for a good life. The foundation for a good life is not a great education, not a fantastic family, not all kinds of friendships, not all kinds of wealth. Those are the kinds of things that so many people think are the foundation for a good life. It is not true. The foundation for a good life is something that's available to all people, no matter how poor we are or what our situation is in life, because we can all put into practice these powerful teachings of Jesus Christ. That's the foundation, the proper foundation for a life. And when you pass away from this life, I want people to say, hey, I knew him, I knew her, that was a good person, he or she did a lot of good. Build your life on the foundation of the teachings of Jesus Christ, and you will weather many storms and leave behind much good in the world.